A special thanks to Representative Omar of Minnesota. Oh, I forgot. She doesn't like Israel. I forgot. I'm so sorry.
Those sarcastic comments from President Trump about Democratic Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar in front of a conservative Jewish group on Saturday came less than a day after a New York man was charged with threatening her life. The man was charged with threatening to assault and murder a United States official for a phoned-in threat he allegedly made last month. He told investigators that he was a patriot, that he loves the president, and that he hates radical Muslims in our government. This is according to the FBI affidavit. Congresswoman Omar responded to both Trump's attack as well as the death threat leveled against her with a bilingual tweet. "My Lord, forgive my people, for they do not know." Meanwhile, in that same speech, Trump implied dual loyalty by American Jews to Israel, which is, incidentally, the same anti-Semitic trope for which Congresswoman Omar has been criticized.
I stood with Prime Minister Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu. I stood with your Prime Minister at the White House to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is something I've been hearing about for a long time.
In response, the American Jewish Committee tweeted, quote, "Mr. President, the Prime Minister of Israel is the leader of his or her country, not ours. Statements to the contrary from staunch friends or harsh critics feed bigotry." Joe, I just get scared watching this. It just seems so beyond, just far from who we are.
Well, listen, it was like he was Mr. Magoo up there.
No, I mean, he thinks he's a comedian, I think.
No. When he says your Prime Minister, he's being bigoted. That is, again, the president who actually reveals himself to believe that Jews in America have dual loyalty, and if you were a Jew in the United States of America, that your Prime Minister must be Benjamin Netanyahu. That is wildly offensive. And again, it is the same sort of anti-Semitic trope that many Republicans were attacking Congresswoman Omar for. Mm-hmm. And Tom Nichols, feel free to talk about that, but also here's yet another example of the President of the United States inspiring his supporters to threaten politicians, to threaten members of the press, to threaten people on the president's enemies list, and yet he never can bring himself to come out and actually condemn those threats. And in this case, he doubled down, attacking the congresswoman who this man said was going to put a bullet in her head, attacking this congresswoman the next day in public.
Doubling down is the president's core skill set. It's what he does. It's one of the things he's best at. You know, there are a lot of people out there who are unhinged, who make threats, but it seems like a pattern is emerging. I mean, instead of it being onesies and twosies and lone wolves, suddenly you're starting to get a lot of these. You're getting a rash of these kinds of incidents with people that are using the same kind of language. And I think, you know, I am always uncomfortable ever drawing direct lines to politicians or their speeches, but I think it's fair to say the president's not doing anything to turn the temperature down on this. You know, I mean, right after somebody's been threatened, you might want to let that joke go that day. You might want to just take a pass on that one and say, you know, today we're not going to do the Ilhan Omar joke after something serious like that. Because again, the president doesn't treat politics like a serious business, like a serious, grave matter. He treats it like an ongoing kind of reality television show. I know that's a trope that we've said, but for him, yeah, it really just boils down to what's working right now at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the problem, Mika, is that that this president, time and time again, inspires people to make death threats. To actually, the lieutenant out of Maryland, who actually had a kill list and was planning the assassination, not only of members of the media, but members of the Democratic leadership and Democrats that were on the campaign trail planning to run against Donald Trump. He could not bring himself to condemn that person who was attempting a wide-scale assassination plot.
And Amna, chime in if you can on the impact of these hateful riffs, because the president is riffing. He goes, flies by the seat of his pants and just goes extemporaneously on stage. But he's, in my opinion, playing with fire. And, every time he opens his mouth, I feel like he takes this country down a peg.
Yeah, Mika, I think you and I both know, everyone speaking here this morning knows that words have consequences. That doesn't seem to have resonated with the president. The real danger here, of course, is that one of these threats actually ends up coming true. And we have to remember the backdrop across which we're having this conversation is at a time of rising Islamophobia, rising anti-Semitism, and strengthening white supremacy, white nationalism, far-right extremist groups that have been growing not only in number but also in actions over the last several years. And while we have to be really hesitant about drawing a straight line from any one set of words to any one set of actions, all of these things have been unfolding and growing steadily over the last several years. This administration, though, has done less to condemn it, has actually taken away resources from the kind of agencies and law enforcement that would actually address some of those threats that are increasingly going to threaten American communities. And I don't think we've seen, unfortunately, I don't think we've seen the worst of it just yet.
So, Jim Vandehei, we've been talking this morning about, obviously, the president's harsh rhetoric on the border, the harsh actions he's taken on the border, this speech where he's constantly poking and prodding and trying, as Tom said, trying to get that 33, 34, 35% as solidly behind him as possible. What does the next year look like? He knows he has to win Wisconsin. He knows he has to win Michigan. He hopes to win Minnesota. He knows he has to win Pennsylvania. What does the next year look like? Does he do anything to try to expand that base out? Or does he continue this strategy that has put him at a 31% reelect in your home state in Michigan?
Yeah, I'll tell you what he tells people and how his campaign looks at this race. They look at the last election, the off-year election, as it was a referendum on him. They think they think his reelect is going to be a choice. It's going to be a choice between him and someone that they're going to label as a socialist. And so the language is going to get harsher. The line is going to get harder because they're going to try to portray him as the protector of capitalism, the guy who did what he said he was going to do, versus a new Green Deal socialist. And they think that resonates. They think that there is a hidden vote of 4 to 5% in the states that you just mentioned. They think if he's running against someone who is from the far left, who can easily be labeled as a socialist, they think that number goes up. They think that there's conservative white Democrats. They think there's independents that will swing his way. Once again, they think all of us are wrong in how we're looking at politics, that we're looking at polls that they don't think matter, and that they think that the issues that we don't think resonate, like immigration, do. And to his credit, like, he was right last time, and we were wrong. And so I don't think it's insane to think that he could be right. And if you look at the dynamics in the Democratic Party, at least early on, they could be playing into his hands because a lot of the talk is on topics like the new Green Deal, Medicare for all, other topics that can be easily characterized as socialism. And if it's a choice like that, that's what he thinks is his road to re-election.
All right, Jim Vandehei, thank you very much. And still ahead, Democrats are on pace to have the largest presidential primary field in campaign history, and some worry it's too many choices. NBC News political reporter Alex Seitz-Wald joins us with that new reporting and insight. Plus, the Washington Examiner's David Drucker is taking a look at the huge fundraising numbers that some freshman Democrats are pulling in. Those two new reports are straight ahead.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.